but two things will be true. I'll go home tired, and I'll go home full. You guys have been good to treat us well the last couple of days. It's been a busy weekend. I was just thinking, normally when you preach in a gospel meeting, you preach 6 sermons over 4 days. I would have spoken 6 times in 2 days. And so that's what you call getting more bang for your buck, I guess, or in a consumer-minded economy. I guess that's a good thing from your point of view. Maybe a bad thing. I don't know. Hopefully good. But anyway, I wasn't sure exactly what to discuss today, and so I've got a couple different things to talk about. And there's something this morning that I thought would put out there. And this is something that, and I want to invite your discussion. I don't know normally how Bible class goes, but you feel free to pipe in and comment along the way. I may ask some of you to read if you'd like along the way. What time is Bible class over? 10:15. Okay, so about 35 minutes. I was going to make sure to try and adapt this where we come out just right. That's always challenging. But a little bit what I want to talk about today is something that is facing our culture. It's facing especially our young people. And I know many of you are affiliated with the college at Moorhead. Got strong ties to that school. I know this is Mississippi Valley's homecoming weekend, and they won in the last 19 seconds, so hooray for them, the Delta Devils. I know we have another college up in Cleveland, Delta State. There are a lot of schools here locally, and that's a big part of the Delta. That's not a bad thing at all. But unfortunately, in the academy and in our universities now, we are seeing a lot of bad ideas that have filtered down. And it didn't just start today. You know, you've all seen the picture or the meme or the caricature of the old man or the old woman who's saying, well, kids these days, right? Y'all all seen that? Or maybe you even felt that. And I've heard a lot of people say, I don't know what's wrong with kids these days. And I told someone not long ago, I said, it's because of all you hippies back in the 60s. and they kind of got offended. but I said, this isn't new. What's going on and what we're seeing in America and our culture right now is something that's been in the crock pot. It's not something that was cooked up in the microwave. And the people in our culture who are pushing secularism and progressivism, they started way back right after World War II. And we need to understand that these are not new thoughts or ideas. And it began with this concept that, and we're going to talk about it in a minute, it's essentially moral relativism. But the idea that there is no set standard for right and wrong. You may have heard some terms thrown around like modernism or post-modernism. And we really, I would argue, and I'm not a sociologist, but I think we're probably on the heels of the postmodern. I don't know, that they're still trying to figure out what this time frame is going to be called when you think about our moral reasoning. But modernism was the idea that we needed to challenge all accepted truths. Now, I don't know how many of you, and just out of curiosity, when did the church experience amazing, rapid growth in America? I've always heard the 50s and 60s. I think if you look at the numbers, it's probably going back from the 30s to the 60s. But because a lot of that growth, it came full bloom in the 60s when the people who were converted were having children, etc. And my whole life, by the way, I was born in 81. I've told everyone, I always hear about the good old days, and I feel like, that's not good for our young people to always hear about how good things used to be, But I think one reason that our evangelism models worked so well back during that time, it was a cultural concept of modernism. And the general cultural, out in the world, the general idea was we need to question social norms, accepted norms. Well, what do we do when we come in and study with someone? We kind of take Jesus' approach from the Sermon on the Mount. Well, you have heard, but I say to you, right? And he says that 7, 8 times there in the Sermon on the Mount. And so we kind of come in and we say, well, you've heard baptism is essential, but let me show you what the Bible says. And so someone would say, oh, well, I've questioned my norm, and so this acceptance of a new norm was very conducive to evangelism. And that's, I think, part in why the church grew so well during that time. Well, then came the hippies and the sexual revolution and the free love and the free open-mindedness, drugs, rock and roll, all that stuff in the 60s. And all of that was a result of what was going on in the academy. We need to understand this. This stuff, those were the fruits of the thought. But we began with modernism by questioning moral standards. And then in postmodernism, the conclusion was made, maybe there are no moral standards. And so from about the really in popular culture from the 60s up until the 90s, or maybe in the early 2000s, we really had this idea in America that was really growing and had come full bloom by the 2000s, 2010s, that there is no moral standard. And so we hear things now that have become very popular taglines like, live your truth. Live your truth. We hear that all the time. And what does that mean? That means that what is true and what is moral and what is right is based on what feels good or what, through your interpretation and here's the term we're hearing today, your lived experience. We hear that an awful lot today. Well, you don't know about my lived experience. And the idea is you've never been in my skin and had to live like I've had to live, and so you can't tell me what's right and wrong. Now, this is that new age. So when you go from questioning the moral standards to saying there are no moral standards, I think the age we're in now is everyone's now setting their own moral standards. So do y'all see the progression there? We question the moral standards. There are no moral standards. Well, there are now, but they're set by each individual.
Judges 17.
That's it.
Your man did what's right.
That's right, and that's actually one of the texts I've got right here, on the very first part of my outline here. And so, what I want to discuss a little bit, and this is something we need to understand that this is something we need to be talking with our kids and our grandkids, is this idea that there's got to be a way to determine what's right for the Christian. Now, the easy answer is, well, it's the Bible, right? That's the easy answer. But I'm telling you, if we confront someone today, and we try to study with someone today who's bought into this moral relativism nonsense, or this self-established morality that we're seeing so common, and we just say, well, the Bible says what's right, and they'll be like, well, that's not how I read it. I got a different message from the Bible, and I'm going to take my message and apply it. So we've got to get down really to the way they think about things. We've got to get down to the base factor on why are they making their judgments? And what I love to do is I love to use absurdity. I'm about to get my lesson. I'm just trying to give a big introduction, kind of tell you where all this is coming from. I love to use absurdity. Now, I don't see any little ones in here, so I'll go ahead and say what I'm about to say, because this is the most ludicrous of all. We hear the phrase now, love is love. Have y'all heard that? What does that mean in popular culture? What does that mean?
Everything's sexual.
Okay, but what is the defining statement they are making by that, the moral statement they're making when they say love is love?
Whatever you want it to be.
Okay?
Anybody else?
Let's go a little deeper.
Love whoever you want to.
You can love whoever you want to. The love I have for this person, whether it's a man or a woman or two dogs and a cat or whatever, that love's the same as a husband and a wife. Love is love. That's what that statement's making. So what that is, that's actually an appeal to the heart, which this is very common in our current culture, because when I establish my own religion, one of the things that happens is I'm basing my morals on my feelings. And of course, the Bible warns us about that multiple times. So what they're saying is, well, you love your spouse, well, I love this person in the same way you love your spouse, and who are you to tell me love is love, right? Well, let's take that argument to absurdity. What if a son loves his mother? Can they have a relationship that spans the sexual?
They would say no even to that.
Why? Right, but why would they say no?
Because
Because it grosses them out, right? Because that's incest, right? And so consent, because now consent has become the only limiting factor to sexual. Now I'm just talking about the sex. We can make these arguments in anything. What's that?
I'm going to say the North American Man-Boy Love Association.
Oh, yeah, the NAMBLA, yeah.
There's an effort to move the age of consent down to whatever the adult wants it to be.
That's right, that's right. And even those are being pushed.
Yeah.
But the average person, I found when you talk about like incest, that pushes it to absurdity. And they say, no. And normally they'll say, well, why is that wrong? Well, if they had children, well, what if they're not going to have children? What if it's two women that are sisters that want to have a relationship? Is that sinful? Well, that just grosses me out. Well, now you're making a judgment about them. I thought love was love. Now we can take this into 1,000 other places. Just like abortion. The common thing I'm hearing now in abortion, and you hear it all the time, and it's so ridiculous, is that the age of viability, or the point of viability. You ever heard that?
Yes.
No abortion past or what's the other term? I'm not saying that just right. There's another term they use. But anyway, the point when the fetus is viable outside the womb. There is no child who is viable outside the womb until at least age 12 or 13. Now, am I wrong? You take a 3-year-old and without the mother and father's help, let them just go out into the world and fend for themselves. How long are they going to live?
How close is the nearest highway?
Well, that's what I'm saying. I mean, this idea that a child can live outside the mother's womb doesn't need the mother's help. The child needs the mother's help for many years after birth. This concept that somehow living without an umbilical cord is the marker of life, and if that's the case, well, you can just push all these things to absurdity and say, well, what if this child, really doesn't turn out the way you like it at 3 months old and things aren't going well and it's just not sleeping? Why not just go ahead and knock it off then, right? I mean, so these things, and by the way, there are people who would argue that.
Governor Northam from Virginia.
Yeah, there are people who would say, you know what? Yeah, probably so. Were you going to say something, Gary?
No.
Okay, good. All right. I'm just kidding. Y'all been giving me a hard time, so we're going to return the favor. All right, so let's begin. So there's a large debate currently between moral relativists and moral objectivists. And moral relativism is the idea that there's no universal or absolute set of moral principles, and essentially to each their own. I set my standard. Moral objectivism, which is the view most of us, I hope, Christians hold, because you can't really be a Christian unless you are a moral objectivist, is the idea that there is a universal or absolute set of moral principles. And, there's a multitude of people in our world. Gene already mentioned the book of Judges. The very last verse of the book of Judges, Judges 21:25, says, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And that's what's being pushed in our culture today. I was born this way. This is how I am. Don't tell me how to live. Don't tell me how to behave. I will set my moral standards. Well, a world without any morality would devolve into a Darwinian nightmare. You go read Psalm 12 about those people and the people that David, those were people sort of like that. This is people like before the flood. And, where the Bible says that the wickedness on earth was so great that it just grieved God in his heart that he had made man. When you look at places like Sodom and Gomorrah, which, by the way, I don't know if y'all seen the archaeological news, but in the last 2 weeks, they have discovered that somehow the area that used to be Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed by something like a great giant meteorite that split in pieces and burned it all at an extremely high temperature somewhere around 3,700 years ago.
I don't believe it.
Archaeologists said it. It must have happened. And, amazingly, in the 19th chapter of our Bible, we knew that story already.
Yeah.
But the reason that city was destroyed, we normally link it to...
God destroyed it, didn't he?
Yeah.
Okay, that's the difference right there. God did that, okay?
Right.
We don't have it to do today. Nobody is God here.
Right. But what I'm saying is now archaeologists are saying something just like we've always been saying happened there, and to them it looks like a giant asteroid or meteorite hit the place and it was on fire and incinerated the city. Probably about what it looked like if you were standing off on the plain looking in the distance. Fire came down from heaven. You go read the text. You know, what would a meteorite look like? It looked like fire coming down from heaven. Because remember, in the Old Testament, heaven is not where God is necessarily. Heaven is the sky. In the beginning, God made the heavens and the earth. And so the heavens there are the sky, the atmosphere, you know, et cetera, et cetera. But anyway, all that being said, we normally think of Sodom and Gomorrah as being an evil place because of the homosexuality and the rape that was going to happen there of the angel. But, you know, the picture there is of complete moral depravity. That is what happens when a nation or a society or a culture has lost all moral objectivism and they've completely abandoned everything moral. That's what happens, and that's what it devolved. That's the end result. And so, you know, when Paul talks about in Romans chapter 1, the moral depravity among the Gentiles, he says they even, and now he starts talking about things like homosexuality. He said that's the end result. And so now the stuff we're seeing, I think here in America, with boys are girls and girls are boys, there's no different, and love, all this nonsense, that's the end fruit that started way back when we started saying there is no objective truth. And that's where we are. And so a lot of older people I've seen have really been shaking their heads. I don't know what's going on with kids these days. And I said, well, it's been going on for years and years and years. It's been the slow build. And it's in the universities. It's in the academy. The people that we educated in the 60s and got their degrees are now the ones teaching in the university and pushing these ideas and thoughts. And it's growing. And I'm not against education at all. In fact, I plan to get graduate degrees one day. But we got to be careful, because what happens is they become little laboratories of secularism, and they start self-producing their own little, you know, new teachers, and they spread, and these ideas become like cancer. And so this has happened. So one of the things we need to understand is that objective morality is necessary for an orderly and a civil society. You know, you go look at the book of Judges, and it looks like a sine wave. I mean, it's just, you know, everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Goes down to the bottom, God oppresses them, they repent, they work righteousness, God sends a judge, they're delivered. For a while they have prosperity, sine wave up, now everyone does what's right in his own eyes, up and down. That's the whole book, is a story of when you follow and serve God, you're blessed, and when you don't, you're cursed. And it's a moral cautionary tale for our own society and our own nation. And so it's something we need to think about. Now, next big block here. We, as Christians, and this is where the rubber meets the road, because I can't do anything about what's going on at the academy. I mean, I've got a son in when I say the academy, I mean among the university world, right? Among colleges and the academic writers, those who are putting out. I've got a son in college, and he's already got a professor that came in, and you know, they're really pushing some hardcore. He said, what do I do? And I said, just always tell the truth. I said, but on the test, put the answers you know he wants to hear. Because, you know, you can't fail out sometimes, and it's a history class, but, you know, history's being boomeranged around and trying to teach other stuff. But anyway, that's a whole other ball of wax. But in the church, this is very important, we have to stick to the idea of an objective morality. Because we see morality as derived from God and from His nature. There is a right and a wrong. That's the case with the maid. And its origin is from our God. You know, there's no debate that the Scriptures embrace a set morality. In fact, our laws, for now, are still based on things like the Ten Commandments, the Noahide laws, you know, the 9 Noahide laws that happened after the ark and after the flood, you know, things like that, the Ten Commandments, some of the teachings of Jesus. All of that is wrapped up and put into our legal code. And legal scholars that are honest will still tell you that. You know, you go to Washington, D.C. I've never been. Anyone ever been to Washington, D.C.? Yeah. Most everybody but me. All right, so y'all can tell me. You know, you'll see, Moses is in the Supreme Court.
Every one of the national monuments has some reference to biblical principles.
That's right.
The top of the Washington obelisk, there's, I forget what it says, but
Thou stay, isn't that it?
I think that's it. That's
Yeah.
It. Yeah.
Praise be to God. Yeah, exactly. Every building, every structure, the crazy bunch of kooks in Congress. You go into Congress and there's Moses and Elijah, the lawgivers and the prophets. They're all right there behind them. But when we focus in for the State of the Union address, they always focus that camera in when we cut off the biblical characters right above their head. But if you were sitting in there, there's biblical characters right there. And the reason is because our founders understood that the Bible was the author of morality. And if you go from an evolutionary standpoint, and this is something that modern thinkers like Steven Pinker, anyone ever heard of Steven Pinker? He's one of the four horsemen of the atheistic apocalypse, they call him, and him and the guy over in England, Dawkins, and anyway, several of these guys. But anyway, he's written books about how morality could have evolved out of evolution. And his arguments are weak and poor. Because the fact of the matter is, if in fact evolution were the standard for morality, then human beings, he says, well, we found out that by living in concert we all benefit more. But that's not true. You go over to Africa, on the continent of Africa, and look at the warlords there. You go into the Middle East and look at the ones who oppress women and, have 17 young women. They're not really suffering for their oppression, are they? I mean, they're not, and so all these arguments, they fall flat when you put them into practice. They sound good on paper, but the fact is there is no source of morality outside of the Scriptures. And so we look at places like Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5, the law of Moses, the Ten Commandments, the Pentateuch, and we see here that there are things clearly labeled as right, good, bad, and evil. Those are words that our society doesn't use anymore. There's no such thing as right, or good, or bad, or evil. Or here's one that never gets used anymore. This is a dirty word today, wicked. Wicked. There are things that are wicked. Today if someone commits murder, well, he probably wasn't loved enough by his mother. Well, maybe so, but he still is wicked. His actions are wicked.
You're awfully judgmental.
I am. And I judge based on the law of God. It doesn't bother me at all. Yeah. In the book of John, the apostle of love, says in verses 19 through 21, and this is the condemnation. What's the condemnation? What's the judgment? That the light has come into the world, and men love darkness rather than light, because their deeds were evil. For everyone practicing evil hates the light and does not come to the light, lest his deeds should be exposed. But he who does the truth comes to the light, that his deeds may be clearly seen that they have been done in God. Now, by the way, that's 3 verses after John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave. 3 verses later, John says this, and we don't need to miss this. This is a huge verse. We could end the class with just analyzing what he says here. But he says here, the light has come into the world. This is the condemnation, that the light has come into the world, and men loved darkness rather than light. Why, John, did they love darkness rather than light? Because their deeds were evil. For everyone practicing evil hates the light and does not come to the light, lest his deeds should be exposed. Here's where the dirty truth lies of moral relativism. When I come in and I'm judgmental, as Gene just said, and I say, you ought not to sleep around. Well, who are you to judge? The truth is what I'm doing, I'm shedding light on his deeds that he inherently knows are evil because he has been formed in the image of God and he has a conscience that's been seared at some point, but it knows deep down that that's evil. And what light does is it exposes that wickedness and it makes him feel bad. And that's why he hates the light. John explains this very clearly. This is why today when we preach or we teach or we try to put forth the idea that there's right and wrong, the world gets so angry and they gnash their teeth. Because what we're saying is you are not a good person and your deeds are not good. They would rather practice their sin in the darkness than have the light of moral truth put on them. That's what John's saying here. It's a deep thought. And it's one that, Jesus was the light of the world to illuminate the wickedness and to push it out. We're going to say something.
It's hard for me to sit here without saying, what you're talking about is paganism. You're talking about idolatry.
Right,
That's it. Because I can do paganism, lets me do what I want to do, lets me choose the church of my choice.
Right. And it's also, I mean, it's hedonism is what it is. It's whatever feels good with no thought about whether it's right or wrong. And, you know, the light, as he keeps talking about the light here, exposing that, you know, it's just, you know, when you steal something, you know, you're probably more likely to lock your car at night than you are in the day. Now, that may not always be true. If you go to Shreveport, lock it all the time. Because, you know, they'll steal stuff right at noonday when people driving by. They don't care. But you know, in the past, the idea was, you know, and I remember hearing when I was a kid, nothing good happens after midnight. Y'all ever hear that when y'all were a kid? You know, the idea was you need to be home because nothing good happens. Why? People tend to get in trouble in the dark. That's just something that happens in the real light in the dark. But here's talking about spiritually speaking, that when we speak truth and we give moral guidance to the world, that's a form of light that illuminates right and wrong behavior. And evil people don't want that eliminated. So that's something we need to think about. All right. There are defined consequences for actions that are right, good, bad, and evil in the Bible. You know, Galatians 6, 7, and 8. Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, that also shall he reap, right? For he who sows to his flesh will of the flesh reap corruption, but he who sows to the Spirit will of the Spirit reap everlasting life. You know, it's always amazing to me that so many behaviors that are being pushed for and normalized end in such horrible, horrible, tragic, broken lives. But no one wants to talk about that. You know, if the preacher says something about alcohol consumption, he's meddling and causing trouble and this, that, and the other. And yet, I heard a man say several years ago, no one will have on their tombstone, Budweiser made my life better. Nobody. But I've been to a bunch of funerals, and I've been to funerals where they poured beer on the grave. I mean, I was almost admitting that because I'd rather the dirt get it than people. But, you know, I don't understand this idea because when you look at the statistics and when you look at the numbers and when you look at the real lives, you see broken marriages, broken homes, you see DWIs and people in jail, you see automobile wrecks, you see spousal abuse, you see child abuse, you see all these other things tied to this behavior. But if we put light on it, oh, you're the bad guy, you're right. So again, there are clearly defined consequences for behavior. So when you look at things like adultery, you know, the proverb writer says the one who commits adultery destroys his own soul. And we see that. When a man or a woman leaves their spouse and finds another person, they not only destroy the home and destroy the life of any children that may be involved, but they destroy themselves. And we see it so often because those lives tend not to be, you know, spiritually prosperous. Now they may go on to do great things in the world, but they're destroying their soul. In the book of Ecclesiastes chapter 11 verse 9, the ecclesiastical writer says, "Rejoice, O young man, in your youth, and let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth. Walk in the ways of your heart and in the sight of your eyes. But know that for all these, God will bring you into judgment." You rejoice, you live in the sight of your eyes. Do what you want to do, but you need to know that you're going to have to answer for what you do. That's a biblical principle. Ecclesiastes 11:9. In John chapter 5, 28, 29, Jesus said, "Do not marvel at this, for the hour is coming which all who are in the graves will hear the voice of the Son of God and live. Those who've done good, the resurrection of life. Those who are in evil, the resurrection of condemnation." There are clearly defined consequences for behaviors. Our view of morality is based on the nature and character. This is the most important, perhaps, point of the lesson this morning. And this is something we need to be teaching our children. Why is that wrong? The answer is clearly not because I said so. Sometimes that's enough, by the way. That's enough. And when your child's 3 and come back, get out of the road. Why? That's enough. They need to know, listen to what I say. Sometimes I don't have time to write the book and tell you all the details. But our children need to understand that the reason we tell them to behave certain ways, not to behave certain ways, and God has put a standard in our life, is because moral behavior reflects the character and nature of our God. That's the most important point, perhaps, that we can teach our children. Right and wrong are simple things that are in agreement or against the character and nature of God. You know, the basis of God's the basis of God's nature is love. What does John say, 1 John 4:8? God is love. Romans 13:8 through 10 tells us this, and I love this passage. It says, owe no one anything. If we stop there, we could say it's a sin to have debt. But it says, owe no one anything except to love one another. For he who loves one another has fulfilled the law. Did y'all get that? You know, when Jesus is asking in Matthew 22, what's the greatest commandment? It's to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. And the second's like unto it, you shall love your neighbors yourself. On these two, he says, hang the law and the prophets. And when you look at that, the reason that is true is because when I love God, I will not do anything to violate His commandments. This is a principle throughout. I've got another lesson I preached one time about the connection between love of God and keeping His commandments, and you'll find it under the patriarchal age, under the Mosaical age, under the Christian age, from Old Testament to New Testament, from front to back, over and over. God talks about to those who love me and keep my commandments. And then Jesus says, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. John says, how do we know Him? If we love Him, we will keep His commandments. Over and over again. And so loving God is tied to behaving like God is. Being like God. And so, back to what Paul says here in Romans 13, he says, owe no one anything except to love one another, for the one who loves has fulfilled the law. Notice what he says. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, you shall not covet. And if there is any other commandment, they're all summed up in this one saying, namely, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And so what Paul says, he takes Jesus' statement, he says, let me explain why that's the second greatest one. Because when you love your neighbor like yourself, you're never going to break a commandment against him. I'm not going to covet his wife. Man, he's got a beautiful wife. You know the old song, if you want to be happy for the rest of your life, never make a pretty woman your wife. Or you better make an ugly woman your wife. It's one of those two. But better get an ugly girl to marry you or something. Yeah, anyway, I can't. It's an old song, but I don't know how many men needed that advice, but the idea throughout the song is she'll love you more if she knows that you didn't marry her for her looks. But anyway, it's just kind of a funny song. But if a man says, man, old Joe over here, his wife's just beautiful. My wife, she can cook good. We ought to have. I don't covet my neighbor's wife. I don't covet my neighbor's house. Well, they got a big, beautiful house. Oh, my house is tiny. No, we need to be happy for them. If we love them, we'll be happy that they have those blessings. And sometimes it's easy to covet, right? What about, adultery? We're clearly not going to commit adultery if we love our spouse. If we love our neighbor, we're not going to cause them to commit adultery or commit adultery with their spouse, whatever the case is. We're not going to steal from someone if we love them. We sure aren't going to murder them if we love them. And so Paul says that all of the commandments to our neighbors, towards our neighbors, are wrapped up in this idea of love. And so what we see happening here is he says here, love does no harm to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfillment of the law. And he's explaining to us that it's all based in love. And so when you look at the first 4 commandments in the Pentateuch, in the 10 commandments, they are all about man's relationship to God. They're what we call vertical commandments. I am the Lord your God. I made this point a couple weeks ago. In the Jewish Bible, or in the Jewish listing of the 10 commandments of the Pentateuch, that is their number 1 commandment. Our number 1 is what? You shall have no other gods before me. They're the same statement. One is a positive statement, one's a negative statement, but it's making the same point. When God says, I am the Lord your God, the Jews understood that meant, okay, well, no other is. And so it's the same thing, but they take those first 4. You shall not make any graven images, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, on the Sabbath day, keep it holy. Those are all about respecting God. And so if I love God, right, I'm not going to break those first 4. And the final 6 are what we call horizontal commands, because they have to do with our interchange with people here on earth. And when I keep those commandments, I'm demonstrating my love for my neighbor. And so when we say that moral objectivism is based on the nature and character of God, this is essentially where we're getting at the heart of it, is that God is a loving God, and when we act like people of love, we behave like people filled with love. And in fact, to truly be a son of God, we must submit to his nature. How many people have ever heard, man, your son's just like you? Or seen somebody, the son is a carbon copy of the father. Or daughter, carbon copy of the mother. You take your pick. It happens quite often. And so, what John says in John chapter 1, verses 12 and 13, is that through faith, we got the privilege to be called the sons of God. And we see this in our convictions. I think becomes God said. I feel becomes God wants. And we've got to change that. It happens in our lives. And in our lives where we are making moral decisions about things. It's not, well, I think this is right, but no, God said I shouldn't, or God said I should. It happens in our worship, where so many people say it really doesn't matter how you worship or what you believe or what you do. No, this is what God wants. All that changes. And finally, as we wrap this up in the last minute or two, a divinely based morality will not agree with the world. I'll say that again. A divinely based morality will not agree with the world. I think one of the biggest disservices to our generation is, for a lot of years, American culture was similar to biblical morality. Similar. Okay? The standards of behavior in the culture and our legal system and all have at least, not completely, don't get me wrong here, but in some small part, they've sort of reflected Christian culture, and it's given us this false idea, I think I mentioned it yesterday, that as long as I'm a good citizen, I'm a good Christian. And so we come up with these concepts like, well, if it's legal, it must be moral. When they legalized gambling in Louisiana, all of a sudden a lot of people who said gambling was a sin didn't anymore. Because they were enjoying going to the riverboats. Or they wanted to play the lottery when, it wasn't Powerball back then, it was Louisiana lottery. But, things like that. Morality changed. And when drinking laws get put into place, or age of consent gets changed, people generally use that to govern what's moral. And as Christians, we just don't. We are to keep the laws, but the law does not set what's moral. God set what's moral. And we need to understand that our morality has to be based on God's teaching. I want to close with this last passage, and that is, I have to get comfortable. We have to get comfortable. Church, we've got to be comfortable with being uncomfortable in the world. We've got to be comfortable being uncomfortable in the world. Jesus said in John 15, 18 through 21, and I'm going to close with this text. If the world hates you, you know that it hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love its own. Yet because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. Remember the word that I said to you, a servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they also will persecute you. If they kept my word, they will keep yours also. But all these things they will do to you for my name's sake, because they do not know him who sent me. If we're living righteous lives, we will never find a safe place in the American culture, the Chinese culture, the European culture, the Australian culture, in fact, any culture on earth, because we will always be countercultural. And that's something that I've had to grow to understand as I've gotten older, is that it's not my job to be comfortable in this world, but to be comfortable being uncomfortable, if that makes sense. Any final comments or questions as we shut down?
Well, legalizing like the marijuana and stuff like that, even though you're a Christian, so to speak, since they legalize it, it's okay to do.
Right.
Same thing with abortion.
That's right.
If they legalize abortion, then it's going to be okay.
That's right. If I don't go to jail, it's not a sin.
There you go. I mean, people think that
You're
way.
right. You're right. It's an unfortunate perspective on
And I'm
that.
saying so-called Christian.
No, you're right. That's the worldly mindset. But we live to a much higher standard than the world.
And this is, you touched on the idea of authority and people not liking it when a congregation submits to the standard of the Bible.
Right.
The members of the congregation that don't like that, leave.
Sure. Yeah, and this is the thing that what I think bothers so many people today, and I see 2 Chronicles 7, 13, 14 put up a lot with the American flag. If my people who are called by my name. Well, I hate to tell everybody in America, but America was never God's people called by his name. America been what was his name? America
Vespucci
or something like that. Yeah, that's what America's named after. He was Portuguese explorer, I believe. So I don't get it. I know there's a lot of people who think we're the new Israel. If so, we're headed to Babylon. And so, I think we need to be careful about nationalism and all of that. But just something to think on. Don't get discouraged when the world doesn't agree with the gospel, because it never has and it